Okay, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you to day 2 of the Health Equity and Social Justice Conference, the 7th Annual Health Disparities Conference here at Teachers College, Columbia University. I just want to mention that for some reason we're having internet problems here in the building. So for those of you who are online, you may be getting this as a webinar that is delayed as a result of our email here, our internet, going down and coming up and going down. So that also explains why perhaps some of you may have had difficulty sending emails through. But in any event, without further ado, I'd like to present Dr. Patti Rose as our first morning keynote speaker. She has a wonderful bio that's quite detailed, that's here in the program. In addition, Dr. Rose is very proud to have 2 of her books on multicultural competence in the hallway at a table that are available for your perusal and also purchase. And you also need to look out for her 2016 book that will be coming out. And you should also know that my graduate conference coordinator, Brett Burnham, who has managed about 150 PowerPoints, had one thing to say: this was a pure piece of art. This is the best PowerPoint of them all. So we're really excited to see what Dr. Rose is going to bring to us today. So here we go, off to a great start.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. So it is early in the morning on a Saturday, and last night we saw Michelle Alexander. How many of you saw that? I don't know about everybody else, but I'm fired up. I'm always fired up about this issue. So let me start by saying that I graduated from Yale in 1985 with an MPH. And at that time, my primary area of concern was health disparities. And then I attended this wonderful school, Columbia Teachers College, where I received my doctorate in education. And what was my primary area of concern? Health disparities. And so now my daughter, who is in the back, and I have to say this, she was 2 years old when I came here to acquire my doctorate, and I had another baby on the way when I interviewed for my doctorate. And this little girl grew up and is now here at Teachers College working on her doctorate and helping me here today. So I'm really proud of her, and she is the president of the Black Student Network at Teachers College. So she has been raised to do the work, and she's doing the work, and I'm really proud of her. So I do want to say that I praise Dr. Wallace so much for having this conference. I've heard so much about her. When I came here, Dr. Wallace wasn't here. So I didn't have the benefit of experiencing her teaching and leadership. But I know of it. I've always heard of it. So I'm so excited to be here, and I'm pleased that she's doing this conference. But there's a part of me that is angry that I am still talking about this, that this matter has yet to be resolved, that after all that we have put into this, and all the information that has been out there, and all the facts and realities and details and theories and concepts and models and all of that, I am still here dealing with this issue of health disparity. So this morning, let's wake up and let's absolutely get into this on every level. Now, Dr. Wallace mentioned my new book, which is in progress. This, what I am going over right now, is going to inform one of the chapters in that book. So it gives you an idea of where the book is going. So the first thing we want to talk about is the unfortunate contribution of unjust factors to health disparities. So for each factor that I go over, I'm also going to provide solutions. Because the other thing that I think we need to do is we need to look more towards solutions. We know what the problems are. We constantly go over the problem. But how can we solve this now? Not in the future, but now. This needs to be resolved. So let's look at some detail. First, we have food injustice. And this is about spatial and economic factors. Supermarkets are building in low-income neighborhoods, but people cannot afford the food. That's called the food mirage. Then we have food deserts. Supermarkets are built outside of poor communities, and individuals can't get to them due to lack of transportation and economic resources and other factors. So that's one of the issues. Food is a necessity for human survival and development. This is not a questionable statement that I'm making. This is reality. Quality and nutritional value of food matters to attain and maintain good health. Now, globalization, however, pushes for cheaper and more abundant resources to meet increasing demands. But some communities are paying a huge price for corrupted corporate interests. And yes, corporations, we're going to talk about them today because they are involved in this entire situation that's causing problems for all people who are experiencing this gap that we are focusing on. So antibiotics and hormones are fed and given to livestock, and then that is fed to humans. Humans are consuming that every day when they eat their food. Undocumented immigrant workers comprise much of the employee base for meatpacking plants, enduring high risk and little financial gain, often paid well below minimum wage. Consumers are not told crucial information about the products that they are buying. When I go to the grocery store, it's an event. I go and give myself a lot of time, and I walk through aisle by aisle, and I read everything, and I make sure that it's non-GMO, that it's not processed, that it's organic, all of that. Why? Because my body matters. My family's body matters. And the fact that we live in a society that is willing to destroy my physical body, that's a problem. And so I spend time and extra money, which not everyone can do, to make sure that I get good food in my body. So that's a very serious injustice. Companies seek to keep their methods quiet and private. They know what they are doing. They keep it in the dark. But everything in the dark comes to light, correct? That's what my mother always told me. We are in the light right now. It's coming to light what they're doing to our physical bodies. Companies seek to keep their methods quiet, and they have a lot of ways of doing this. So we're going to talk about that. Many people are unable to discern information that relates to their health in making informed decisions. And that is because of health literacy. You see, this ties into education. If you can't read and understand what you need to eat, and not only what you need to eat, but what is wrong with what you are eating, then you can't rectify the problem. So in one of my books that I have with me today, I have a whole chapter devoted to health literacy and education, the relationship between the two, because that's extremely important. So there's a food integrity campaign. When it comes to bringing horrific truths to the public, to the public eye, undercover footage and images are often an effective outlet for whistleblowers who otherwise risk retaliation when speaking up. Going through proper channels to report abuse often results in supervisors intimidating those employees who have made complaints to keep them quiet. So, if you haven't seen the movie Food Inc., see it. Be informed so that you can know where your food is coming from, because people still believe their food is coming from farms and, you know, these lovely places and spaces that used to exist. That's gone. For the most part, that is gone. So we need to be informed. So getting back to health literacy in Chapter 5, this is my point. Unequal educational attainment and lower socioeconomic status, which is the plight of many emerging majority populations in the United States, impacts health literacy. And what is health literacy? We need a definition. The ability to obtain, process, and understand information and services needed to make appropriate health decisions. This is not rocket science, it's basic. If you want to understand what is going on with your health, you have to be health literate. And this is not happening. There is also a correlation between our food and health issues. So, of course, I'm not going to go into all of them because we don't have time, but I am going to talk about just one, and that is obesity. A UC Davis study conducted by Paul Lay resulted in the findings that there is a correlation between obesity and lower level wages. And that correlation is strong. Furthermore, public health scientists have identified several potential reasons why lower wages could support the tendency for obesity. Poorer people tend to live in less safe neighborhoods with reduced access to parks and other low-cost means to activity. Healthy, lower-cost foods also tend to be more expensive and less available in poor communities. Hence, we have the food deserts and the food mirages, which I mentioned at the very beginning of this talk. This is about lack of humanity. What kind of society do we live in that doesn't ensure that everyone has access to good quality food? We all know that we are what we eat. How can we expect people to be healthy when they don't have optimal health literacy? Not having such both food that is healthy for their bodies, information to enable them to make those choices, is an affront to the very people who built this country, who are now largely poor in America, namely black people and other marginalized emerging majority groups. Now note that I'm using the term emerging majority rather than minority. I do not use the term minority because the reality is that in many cities already in this nation, the individuals of color from various groups are already the majority. And it is expected that by, some say 2042, when I wrote my books, it was 2050, the mark is moving, that those individuals, in terms of the groups that are considered people of color, of which I am one, those groups will become the majority in our society. So no more minority. Emerging majority is a very good term to use in describing this. So what is available in food deserts? Let's take a look. Small community grocery stores, convenient but limited inventory. By convenience, they're right there. Prices are higher than the supermarkets in those stores. So you're not saving when you go to the store. You're actually paying more for less. This limits access to healthy food choices. There's fast food restaurants which offer cheap, easily accessible food. That's how they market themselves. We're fast. Individuals with limited income flock to them to feed themselves and their families because of these low prices. But the question that we have to ask is, what is the quality? What is the nutritional value associated with that food that is so readily available in the communities of lower income populations? It's questionable at best and problematic at worst. Alcohol and cigarettes. These are also easily accessible in low-income communities. This provides opportunities for people to turn to alcohol and cigarettes as coping mechanisms because along with low socioeconomic status comes stress. And so we're right here to provide you with stress relief. Alcohol and cigarettes on every corner. These are available in the convenience store as well. So you can get them in 2 locations if you need them. So what are the potential solutions? Because I promised you solutions that I wouldn't just list problems. First is the growing of produce in low-income neighborhoods. Now this is already happening in some places. You find it happening through church groups, advocacy groups, community groups that are planting gardens and so forth on a small scale, and people are flocking to those to try to get healthy food. Availability of organic produce, non-GMO items. Oh, I wish I had time to talk to you all about GMOs. But I was a bio major undergrad, and I teach biology in China during the summers, and I am telling you right now that we need to get back to biology, and we need to understand, because this non-GMO situation something that we need to be aware of so we can make good choices. And hormones and antibiotic-free meat and poultry. Various vendors that accept EBT and products at lower cost. Government subsidies would be useful for these scenarios. So food stamps, now known as the Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program, or SNAP, because you know it's easy, do not provide enough food income for individuals to purchase healthier foods, as unhealthy processed food is more affordable. Placement of supermarkets in low-income communities with affordable prices and healthy food items, de-emphasizing processed foods. This is not complicated. This is what needs to be done to resolve the food situation in our communities. Now I'm going to move on to another topic. And that topic, as I said, was touched upon with such care and concern and information last night by Michelle Alexander. Her book is so informative that at the University of Miami, where I taught for the past 8 years, I developed an entire course around her book. It was called The New Jim Crow Mass Incarceration. That was the name of the book, the class. And we talked about this every day, read papers, her book, dialogues, presentations, everything. And my students were fired up every day because this is so upsetting. But I don't want to just reiterate that. I want to go into something else, and that's prison profiteers. Because the question that we have to start asking ourselves is, why is this happening? What's the reason behind it? Why are you locking up and locking out black people and other people of color in such mass numbers in the United States of America? What's happening? So let's explore prison profiteers. This year at the Academy Awards, there was an outcry that in terms of nominees, it lacked diversity, leading to the hashtag #OscarsSoWhite. Essentially, the only black individual nominees, 2 black men that won Oscars, John Legend and Common, were compelling in their acceptance speeches. I was watching that. I was just so proud of them. And John Legend stated the following to the world. The U.S. is the most incarcerated country in the world, as there are more black men under correctional control today than were under slavery in 1850. And we continued to watch the Oscars. We continued to talk about the fancy gowns and jewelry and all of that, and who's going to win? Who's going to win? The question is, who is losing? Who's losing in our society? Forget the glamour. People are locked out of our society for their lives over petty minor infractions in many cases. That should be our concern. So he said, people are marching with our song. We see you, we love you, he said. March on. So Texas, we're going to use as our example. Recently at Willacy County Correctional Center, there was an uprising. Why? Overflowing sewage, solitary confinement, and poor medical care. Prisoners are incarcerated for immigration, drug convictions, crossing the border without a visa, unlawfully re-entering, and then consequently they are imprisoned rather than deportation under what is called Operation Streamline, which focuses on immigration populations or prosecutions. Carl Takai, an ACLU attorney who worked on a report entitled, listen to this title, Warehoused and Forgotten, Immigrants Trapped in Our Shadow Prison System. That is the title of this report. Describes the appalling conditions of these facilities. Taxes, tax dollars from people who are working in the United States are used to pay for imprisoning other human beings. A universal sense of despair was found in those prisons. Deplorable prison conditions. Examples of those conditions: disgusting living quarters. Inmates' clothes washed with mops and cleaning equipment. Raw sewage overflowed from the toilets, causing a smell that the prisoners found to be intolerable. Excessive solitary confinement. Inmates were placed in the hole for requesting new shoes or food. Solitary drove them to hurt themselves or attempt suicide. And what I want to hone in on is the lack of basic medical care. Complaints of a toothache, the only treatment, extraction. Inmates seeking diagnosis from medical staff for illness were only handed Tylenol and sent away. This is the kind of treatment that human beings are experiencing, because this is not the only prison. This is just a prison where the prisoners got so outraged that they said, we are mad as hell, we're not taking this anymore. So that's what happened in Texas. So we want to talk about Horizon, correctional health care. Horizon Health is the leading provider of correctional health care services in the United States, per their website. So they're proud. Their business model, less care, higher profits. People get sicker, Horizon makes more. Horizon was sued 660 times for malpractice over the last half decade. As stated by one of their own nurses, Diane Jackson, we save money by skipping the ambulance and taking the prisoners directly to the morgue. That's one of the ways they generated an estimated $1.4 billion a year. So this might help us to understand on one level why prisoners are in prison in these mass numbers. The reality is that this is a profit-making venture. And that's the part that we want to talk about, because yes, it's racial. There's race involved. But at the end of the day, what is really involved in all of this is that people are making money once again, because this happened before, if we know our history, they're making money off of taking our prisoners, our people, and locking them up and locking them out. So, let's begin there. Healthcare is a hugely profitable business. As one who has served as a president of a community health center, as a vice president of a community health center, working in the community, working in healthcare, I know that there's a bottom line, and you focus on that bottom line as an administrator because that's part of the role, because there is money to be made. And if you're in a profit scenario, in a profit entity, because those were nonprofits, it is really seriously about the dollar. So as long as Horizon is motivated by its bottom line rather than the health of prisoners, there will always be a perverse incentive to not provide treatment. This is true for the provision of health care in and out of the prison system. That's another talk altogether, but I definitely go there. Because if we look at our health care, including ACA, if we look at that whole situation, it's still about profit in the United States. So in the prison system, it is completely off kilter. It's out of whack. It's out of control. And it's really sad. We should be furious about it. Prisoners have to pay for their health care in the prison, often taking out loans. They have a loan system set up in the prison and the system to do so. So I'm going to play a video, and I know Dr. Wallace said that the internet is not working, so let's just say a soft prayer, and let's hope it works.
Guess what corporation makes an estimated $1.4 billion a year off sick prisoners? Meet Horizon, the country's largest prison healthcare company. Horizon treats more than 300,000 prisoners nationwide. The word treats is used loosely.
My son is incarcerated in the Arizona Department of Corrections in Tucson, contracted hepatitis C. It is damaging his liver, and eventually will do the cirrhosis of the liver, go into liver cancer, and will kill him eventually if not treated. He is treatable and curable, but not receiving the proper treatment.
My partner, Thomas Vogt, and he's been incarcerated here in Tucson, Arizona since 1994. He has an enlarged prostate, and there's also a growth there that needs a biopsy. Hello? We're talking about you. Did you get your pain meds yet?
No. I'm in constant pain. I can't even sit now. They just ignore it.
I cannot tell you how many of the same kinds of stories we hear on a daily, weekly basis. This is what we call malpractice in the medical field.
We save money because we skip the ambulance and bring them right to the morgue. Diane Jackson, nurse at Horizon. In fact, they save so much money, they can pay their CEO nearly $1 million.
We are the industry pioneers. We are the innovators. Our team is unmatched in knowledge and passion.
6 employees have resigned after 2 inmates at Metro Corrections here in Louisville died this year.
Now, those employees are not corrections officers, but workers with Horizon, Louisville's jail healthcare contractor.
There's no question that Horizon is profiteering from mass incarceration in this country.
My son's being told they have no protocol for treating anybody with hepatitis C, so they don't have permission to even give them medicine to prevent the hepatitis C.
There are no medical services being provided, in my opinion.
Horizon's getting taxpayer money in 29 states, and they're vying for more.
The profit motive is inherently at odds with the mission of a correctional institution. There will always be a perverse incentive not to rehabilitate, not to treat.
They need help, and we can't help them. The only thing we can do is fight for them.
Fight the prison profiteers at prisonprofiteers.org. Click here.
So, as was pointed out, there is a reason for what we are seeing in terms of mass incarceration. The solution: take the profit incentive out of healthcare in general and in prison. As expressed in my books and research, culturally competent healthcare is also a must, inside and outside of the prison system. Just care about human beings. That's lost with this profit, which is a serious problem. Also, stringent and comprehensive oversight of entities offering correctional health care. Who is minding the shop? Who is allowing this to happen? Permission for family members' involvement in ensuring the rights of their incarcerated loved ones in terms of health care and beyond. Just because you go in prison doesn't mean that you don't have family and people that love you and care about you. The provision of optimal health care to all is a human right. This is not debatable. It's a human right. Next, the school to prison pipeline. This is another very serious problem. Suspensions. Black boys are suspended 3 times more than white boys. Black girls are suspended 6 times more. The intra-gender comparison of suspension rates: 2% for white girls, 12% for black girls. Zero tolerance has resulted in black students facing disproportionately harsher punishment than white students in public schools. So we see this racial scenario going on. Black students represent 31% of school-related arrests. Students suspended for discretionary violation are nearly 3 times more likely to be in contact with the juvenile justice system the following year. So there was a study released by the NAACP. It's called Misplaced Priorities, which gives you a good idea of what's inside incarceration, undereducate. It examines America's escalating levels of prison spending and its impact on state budgets and our nation's children. It tracks the steady shift of state funds away from education and toward the criminal justice system. Researchers have found that over-incarceration most often impacts vulnerable and emerging majority populations, and this is destabilizing the community. We must stop the school to prison pipeline. We cannot spend years talking about this and theorizing about it. We have to stop it. These are our babies. These are our children. We should be absolutely outraged. We should be in the streets marching, complaining, going to the schools and telling people, this is not acceptable. You will not incarcerate our babies. If we don't have that kind of anger in us, we are lost. In South Florida, the Broward County School Board voted unanimously to sign new rules meant to drive down arrests. This is a simple solution. It's not complicated. It promises appropriate responses and use of resources when responding to school-based misbehavior. That wasn't in place already? You had to put that in place? Broward County School Superintendent Robert Runcie said this: "This was a historic day for ending the schoolhouse to jailhouse pipeline, namely school discipline practices that channel inoffensive activities that young people participate in into the criminal justice system." So the superintendent happens to be black. He came to Broward County. He was new. And he said, oh, no, no, no. This will not be tolerated. This has to be stopped. And he was urged and pushed by the community to do this. No more arrests of children in the K-12 system for matters that can be handled at school. Implement, once again, culturally competent measures in schools so that individuals know how to work with children from various races, cultures, and socioeconomic backgrounds, as well as linguistic competency. So, what are the reasons for the prison pipeline? This is the question that we have to ask. Private prisons need high incarceration rates to meet requirements for contracted private companies. There are businesses that are traded per the New York Stock Exchange. Go to the Wall Street Journal. Go on television to CNBC. Look at business and look for these companies and you will find them there. 90 to 100% occupancy is mandatory per these contracts. And we have mandatory minimum sentences to help them accomplish this. Felony plea bargains. Read the new Jim Crow. You can learn all about that. The three strikes law and immigration detainment, as I covered already in the beginning. Cheap, available labor with significant profits. Private prisons are now advertising themselves as an alternative to the hiring of low-wage workers outside of the country, while we are watching this society fight about whether or not we should raise the minimum wage to $10. That's what they're talking to us about on the outside, where they are racking up workers on the inside and paying them nothing. But no one is fighting for them. And you thought corporations were just shipping jobs overseas? Companies have found people right here at home who work for as little as 93 cents an hour and cannot strike or take vacations. They're called prisoners. The prison workforce is guaranteed not to have car problems, no need for babysitters. They'll be at work on time and available whenever they are needed. They're not paid overtime, do not receive any kind of benefits, no Social Security, no pensions, nor are they permitted to form unions or strike. They have no voice at all. They don't have any paid leave, sick time, or otherwise. And we know they're not getting health care. I just went over that. Their punishment for complaining can be isolation, the whole. Approximately 1 million prisoners work for these corporations. So their hourly rate is as much as $1.25 per hour in the federal prison labor. Example, military helmets, uniforms, pants, shirts, ammunitions, belts, ID tags, and tents. These are some of the items that they're producing. Who are these corporations? Who are they? You're probably wearing things that they make right now, or using things in your homes, and et cetera. All of us. Microsoft, AT&T, Chevron, Nintendo, Starbucks, Bank of America, IBM, Victoria's Secret, Eddie Bauer, Wendy's, Procter & Gamble, Johnson & Johnson, Fruit of the Loom, Motorola, Macy's, Sara Lee, Texas Instruments, Caterpillar, Hewlett-Packard, Nortel, Nordstrom's, Revlon, Macy's, Pierre Cardin, Target, JCPenney, Quaker Oats, and Revlon. Those are some. And I provided sources here for you to go and look at those sources, because we should be furious that we are spending our dollars, our money, to help perpetuate something like this. State prison labor. In New Jersey, as an example, a prisoner made $1.20 for 8 hours of work in 1980. And today, $1.30 for a day's labor. On average, they earn $28 a month. In private prisons, prisoners can earn as little as 17 cents an hour. Another quick film.
While the rest of the U.S. may be struggling for work, there's currently a real boom of job offers for inmates in the country. But state and some of the biggest private companies are now enjoying the fruits of a cheap and readily available workforce, with tens of millions of dollars spent by private prisons to keep their jails full. RT's Gaina Chichikan takes up the story.
In the U.S., the market for cheap labor is booming behind bars. In the last 15 years, partnership between prisons and private manufacturers has increased significantly. They're becoming America's very own Chinese-style manufacturing line behind prison walls. Prisons, in fact, advertise themselves as such, as an alternative to outsourcing cheap labor to China or elsewhere. On the web, we came across this pitch that prisons prepared to persuade private sector companies to come and do business with them. Take a look.
There's not enough folks that will do this type of work in this country. So therefore, we're bringing back this industry that historically has been going out of this country, and we're putting it, inside the walls. And it's absolutely a perfect idea. I have a workforce that does not have car problems or babysitting problems, etc. They're always here and they're always willing to come to work.
Bring your business to our labor.
A wide variety of industries take advantage of prison labor. Among many other things, prisoners make clothing, textiles, electronics, furniture, and even solar panels.
Just as we're trying to get China to stop with their prison labor, ours is at the same time increasing.
Hundreds of companies have used prison labor directly or through subcontractors, including Microsoft, Boeing, Starbucks, Victoria's Secret, and others.
They qualify for federal tax breaks. They can get recompensated up to 40% of the wages that they pay to these inmates. We as taxpayers, we have to house, feed, and provide medical care and everything for all of these inmates. We do this as taxpayers. It comes out of the tax pools. And that keeps the actual prison workforce healthy and in shape to go out and perform these jobs for these private companies.
Hard-working and reliable. Inmates show up for work every day voluntarily.
Work in prison is mandatory, and the choice many inmates have is whether to work for a government-run prison industry for less than $1 an hour or a private one for a minimum wage of around $6. Unicor is a government-owned corporation that uses prison labor to produce all kinds of goods, mainly for other government agencies. 175 different types of products and services. You see the variety listed on their website. They too partner up with private firms now. Last year, Unicor's revenue reached $900 million. As far as private prisons are concerned, two of the country's biggest prison corporations made $3.3 billion last year alone.
Private prisons are traded on the New York Stock Exchange. They are for-profit companies, and the savings that they reap from using inmate labor go to their bottom line. It's money they otherwise don't have to spend in order to keep a facility run.
Large prison populations and harsh sentences result in greater profits. America's three major private prison companies spend around $45 million over the past 10 years on lobbying state and federal governments for supporting immigrant detention, mandatory minimum sentences, three strikes laws, and other legislative measures that contribute to the growth of America's gigantic prison population. The U.S. now holds more people behind bars than any other nation. More than 2 million. That's 1/4 of all prisoners in the world. From a cost-effectiveness point of view, the $45 million that private prisons have reportedly spent over the past decade lobbying to keep prisons full is peanuts compared to the billions that they make every year. One can argue about the many causes and effects of America's skyrocketing incarceration rate, but since prisons became a for-profit industry in the U.S. 30 years ago, the number of prisoners has gone up dramatically. Not to say that it was the only cause behind the spike, but many argue it was part of it. And now with the cheap labor market expanding behind American bars, one is wondering whether the justice system in the U.S. is adopting market values. In Washington, I'm Ganesh Shekan.
So aren't we just ashamed? We should just be ashamed. I travel all over this world, It's part of my work. It's what informs me in regard to cultural competency and so forth. And I can tell you, I am ashamed that this is happening in my country where I was born. I am ashamed. We should all be ashamed. And so when I talk about this, forgive me, you all, but I get upset because I don't want to see this happening to people, to human beings, to my people, to our children, to our bodies, to our minds. I'm upset about this, and we should all be upset. Why do prisoners need to earn money? Let's ask questions. They're in prison because they need to pay for essential basic commissary items that used to be provided to them. Toilet paper, shoes, extra blankets, soap and deodorant, and sometimes for electricity and room and board. They have to take out prison loans for medication, legal and medical fees, and prison sentencing fees. Prisoners can get in debt while in prison, owing fees to the prison when they get out, although payments are taken from their minimal paychecks while they're in the prison. Corporations run the prison phone systems with very high fees for prisoners and their families, so it's difficult for them to even make or receive a telephone call. Now, the work associated with this, Chris Hedges, the sources listed, take a look at his work. I strongly suggest it. The percent of able-bodied, sentenced federal prisoners required to work in the prison is 100%. Factory owners, look at this, CNN Money. They're getting upset because they say the federal prisoners are stealing our business because they have to pay minimum wage. This is unbelievable, isn't it, everyone? This is just shocking. The solution is not complicated. Stop corporations from using prisoners as cheap labor with little to no pay, which is a sinister form of greed, leading to an increase in corporate profits that can be likened to slavery in form and practice. This is in my next book, all of this. Because we need to tell everyone who doesn't know that this is happening. So I'm going to wrap up with emerging and future concerns because it's not ending. Until we stand up and make this stop and get outraged, it's not going to stop. They're creating new ways to continue this. So black men have been imprisoned in the greatest numbers, so much so that the population is being exhausted. So in order to keep the prisons full, rampant imprisonment is now extending to other groups in substantial numbers, including women, poor white people, Hispanic people, because remember Hispanic is a ethnicity rather than a race, so you have white and you have black Hispanic. So initially they were going primarily after the darker hued Hispanics, but now they are also going for the white Hispanic people as well, and immigrants. The U.S. per ACLU data increased its prison population from 1970 to 2005 by approximately 700%. African American girls and young women have fallen through the cracks. They are disproportionately detained and incarcerated by the juvenile justice system. Sociologist Nikki Jones of UC Santa Barbara said, black girls are not committing more crimes, even though they are being incarcerated in record numbers. Dr. Maida Chesney Lind. I've been studying this for decades, she said. We have never seen these kind of numbers before. National policies like zero tolerance, there it is again, are responsible for the school to prison pipeline. And a dual justice system that treats white girls differently from black girls is disproportionately impacting African American girls. In 2008, we knew the arrest rate in California was 49 out of every 1,000 for black girls, 8.9 per 1,000 for white girls, and 14.9 per 1,000 for Latinas. Remember, break up the Latina group. You have black, you have white. So that, again, informs those numbers. And we have to keep that in mind when we're looking at data. So the vicious cycle, this is a vicious cycle. It starts with lower socioeconomic status and marginalized communities. That's the emerging majority people. And think about that, because that majority is coming and there's concern about that. Experiencing health disparities. Unjust factors including food deserts, mirages, poor quality education, health literacy, high unemployment, and beyond. And then we have the dreadful school to prison pipeline, the drug war, immigrant detainment and mass incarceration of emerging majority people. Prison profiteers, scandalous. Medical and corporate, private, federal, and state levels. It's happening on all levels. Prisoner release followed by recidivism due to economic, emotional, spiritual, and overall deprivation and cultural and linguistic incompetency in society. And for that box, please read Michelle Obama's book. I'm going to end with solutions because it's early in the morning on a Saturday. And this is rough, but it's true. An ideal solution, this is ideal, everyone, towards health equity, economic justice, and overall social justice, including food justice and cultural and linguistic competency in all areas. Quality education, employment opportunities, universal health care. We can do that. And health literacy for all. And most importantly, elimination of unjust, escalating negative factors, the drug war, the school to prison pipeline, prison profiteering, and mass incarceration. That is how we will get health equity. Thank you.
Thank you, doctor. That was wonderful.
Thank you.
I have two comments. One is, if women ate one mushroom a day, scientific research proves that 65 to 68% of all women would skip breast cancer. That's nationally recognized research. 85% of all people would skip any kind of cancer if they ate onions once a day. My question is, why doesn't every American know that? Why? You got to ask yourself, why does every woman in this room not know that? The second thing is, if you've never had a friend or loved one in prison, you want to understand this, please sign up to go visit a prisoner. Sign up for the prison-run telephone system and pay $8 a minute to talk to your friends or loved ones. Go try to visit someone. Watch the families who are turned away because they wore the wrong color or they wore the wrong blouse, and sit in the prison waiting room and watch people try to visit their loved ones. And make friends with a prisoner, and you will understand the absolute inhumanity of trying to bring light into one of the darkest places in our country. And if you haven't experienced that directly, I highly recommend that someone experience it. Will change how you view what we're doing directly. So thank you for bringing this to us.
Okay, thank you.
I'm going to ask everyone to give Dr. Rose a standing ovation. That was incredible. This is an opportunity for me to make a point. And the point is that, yes, we have a webinar, it's archived, but in about 2 months, all of the sessions in Cohen are going to be on YouTube. We are absolutely compelled to have our own social marketing campaign where this YouTube video that Dr. Rose just made becomes common household knowledge. This is an absolutely outstanding contribution to our understanding of the multiple injustices, and she's giving us a blueprint. It's raising awareness in ways that we cannot imagine. So I want us all to make a pledge that when this is sent out as a link to her video, that we will all make sure we send it to at least 100 people. All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So, moving on. Well, you know, there aren't many people in the world who can follow such a great talk as that one. But there is one that we have here who can. And that is Dr. Christopher Emdin, who is, for those of you who may think of who are some of the truly great voices of the 20th century, who were those voices? You know, what kind of names come to mind when we think of the great voices, the great scholars, the great thinkers, the great intellectual leaders of the 21st century? Who comes to mind? For some, it might be a Cornel West. Well, I can tell you that we have someone who's destined to triple, quadruple the whatever you might think about the greatest scholar and intellectual thinker that comes to mind for you. And that's in Dr. Christopher Emdin. Now, you can certainly take time and read his bio in this program booklet, but I'm going to invite both him and Ian Levy to come up here so that we can make an announcement before he starts his formal presentation. We're taking this opportunity to not only make a pitch to donors, but also to increase awareness. And that is regarding the manner in which not only do I have one of the best partners in the whole world here, but we also have a Choose Fellow. So we are the Center for Health Equity and Urban Science Education. And with our fellow here, Ian Levy, we are officially announcing at this moment that we are going to launch a certificate program in hip-hop spoken word pedagogy and therapy, as well as a summer training institute, which is going to focus on providing those who participate with mechanisms for more effective teaching and counseling of urban youth of color. Okay? It's going to be a 10-credit, one-year certificate program, and we need success in you taking our interest survey. So the link to our interest survey is actually in the beginning of the program on page, is that 3? On page 3. You need young people around. Okay, so you should download the program on their smartphone and click that link and take the interest survey. It takes about 3 or 4 minutes, because when we apply for formal college approval, we need people to have taken those surveys to tell us, who do you know who might be interested? It's for not only STEM teachers who are going to learn the pedagogy and the practice of how to implement the use of hip-hop in their various classrooms, but it's also for guidance counselors, psychologists, mental health, school psychologists, who also, I mean, you know, you're going to hear at 11, Ian talk about his work as a guidance counselor, having his machinery, his equipment in his office and putting on a beat and helping urban youth to really process their emotions and come to a real awareness and to make progress on their sociocultural and emotional issues. Together, they've just completed an article that's been submitted for publication on how schools have to have spaces for this kind of emotional processing. That's how we're going to stop the school to prison pipeline, one way. So without further ado, and with having formally launched our new certificate program, I offer you Ian's mentor, my partner, the one, the only, Dr. Christopher Emdin. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Before I get into my talk, there are a few things I just wanted to share with you all. The first of which is, we're here today in this new sort of new iteration of this conference and this work that we're doing. I just want to share some things with you guys just to start off with. Any work that has a purpose of really transforming practice and switching paradigms and investigating new ways and approaches to teaching and learning and serving new populations, whether you're talking about in health equity and education, never begins with tons of adulation, folks cheering you on from the sidelines. Anyone who's doing the work that's sort of moving against the established paradigm is not going to be fully embraced by the structures that be. When Dr. Wallace and I got together and started envisioning this work of bringing hip-hop in with health equity, with science education, many looked at it as what are these people doing? It doesn't quite make sense how they're sort of carving out this space. But there's one thing that we knew was that in each of those domains that we were bringing together, the inequities persist and continue to persist. And we also knew that the mechanisms that have been used in place up until this point to be able to address those things have not worked. When we're talking about health disparities, those issues, the numbers, never decreased to a point where we can say we've reached something that even has an inkling of equity. When you're talking about urban education, same issue. You're talking about science education, the inequities triple and quadruple. So this work is not a work that's done for the sake of having folks convene for the sake of convening. It's really work that's done because something different has to happen. Einstein says insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. Many of us, even those of us who have a language of transforming practice and doing things in innovative ways, have had our language adopted by the structures and powers that be, and so we have a really conventional way of doing the same thing over and over again. So this work is not going to be fully embraced. When I get asked to give talks in places to sort of describe the landscape of urban education, this auditorium and 3 or 4 more of it are filled because they want me to say the same issues over and over again. They want me to sort of, re-describe problems that they know exist for the sake of them hearing what they want to hear. And whenever we're talking about doing work that's really moving the agenda forward, bringing new frameworks, transforming thinking, it's sparse and unsupported. So know that each of you who are here today are deeply appreciated, not just because you're here, but because you're part of the little drop of water that makes the mighty ocean to transform this work. And so with that, I'll start. To me, this isn't an academic conference, and this isn't a keynote. It's a convening of hearts and minds and souls who refuse to use the frameworks that have been given to us to define the experiences of people across the globe who've been relegated to subaltern positions and viewed as unable to, unequal to, unwilling to be more than what they can be. And so that's interesting because you say, well, Dr. Emdin, this is a conference. We had a call for proposals. We're an amazing institution. You guys are all sitting down. This guy is giving a speech. So how is this not a conference? How is this something different than an academic conference? And the reason why I describe this as not that is because it's all a matter of perspective and it's all a matter of mission, right? So what makes this different than an academic conference is the take that we use to engage in this work. Let me give you an example. So my 2-year-old, we get home and we play, and she's a big player. She has these like little rubber bands, and she'll take the rubber bands that are supposed to be for her hair, and then she'll stretch them out and she'll make bracelets. And she'll say, Daddy, Daddy, bracelet. And she puts tons of bracelets on her hand. Now, by every definition that I know, it is a rubber band. But to her, it is a bracelet. And who am I to argue with her brilliance because she's decided to make the rubber band into a bracelet? So it's just a matter of perspective. I'll give you another example. Again, back to my daughter. She will walk into the room, sit on the couch, grab a plate after she's finished eating, and starts using the plate as a steering wheel. And I say, Sydney, what are you doing? And she goes, Sydney's driving, Papa, Sydney's driving. I'm like, you're driving? And, I was like, man, is something wrong with my daughter? She thinks she's driving in the car, and then she'll tell me to get in. So I'll sit next to her, and then she'll drive. And as she drives, it's a different perspective on a very different experience. Who am I to tell her what she's doing is not anything other than what I know it's to do. It's just different. But here's the interesting thing about using a different framework to address or frame something that you've seen a certain way before. What happens is, if you're willing to engage in the work of moving out of your own established paradigm to sit in the imaginary car to see where she's going, she gives you keen insight into the world from her perspective. So the one thing I gained by getting into the imaginary car with my daughter was how crazy of a driver I am. Because she's turning and she's turning, right? And then she's yelling at the imaginary people to get out of the way. And so all of a sudden, by being willing to sit in the car with her, although it's not a car, the willingness to move beyond the way I perceive things to be and be a passenger allows me to be able to look at my work or what I was doing in a very unique way that I did not know before. So what I'm asking each and every one of us to do today is to not engage in the practice of this being an academic conference, but to look at this as a convening of ideas surrounding these issues, so that we can look again at our practice from the framework of something different, so we can have more keen insight into how we do this work. Can y'all do that with me? Yes. Now, the reason why I'm asking you to do that with me is because that is what a lot of folks who lead us to where we are today have done for a very long time. Use different language and frameworks and lenses to be able to describe the phenomena that we experience so as to not have us see it as inequities and injustice. Our previous speaker spoke about UNICOR, this government organization that employs these prisoners for cents on the dollar to engage in this work. But do you know what UNICOR describes their work as? Inmate release preparation. And she likened the work to be like slavery. I would say it is slavery when you have folks who are pushed into this system and forced to engage in free labor, but they've been able to look outside of the box, develop a different framework, call it inmate release preparation, and engage a different audience to be able to support their practices that are oppressive to a population. The willingness to be able to maneuver the structures that we see, to play this game of smoke and mirrors, to be able to convince an audience that they're engaged in proper practice, is part of the tools of the oppressor. At the same time, we engage in work and describe the problems as they see it, so that this becomes an academic conference where folks with letters after their names speak and talk in different ways. But we refuse to call it a conference anymore. It's a convening of minds and souls to revolt and buck against the system, to create new practices, to get in the car with Sydney and let her show us what we do when we drive. Y'all with me? Yes. So I was supposed to talk about science education, and I probably will at some point. But what I want to talk about in the context of our talks earlier, our talks last night, what I've been hearing, walking the hallways, is to talk about what I term the new PTSDs. Now, we all know PTSD to be the words roll off our lips easily. And there are always these associations made with who is a person who is suffering from or needs to be healed from a post-traumatic stress disorder. That word, that term, was actually constructed and made to become most visible by the government in order to be able to help us to be able to describe what has occurred with soldiers who've been sent to battle. And as they've come back, rather than describe the process in ways that will be hyper-negative towards the process of sending them there, we can diagnose this and make this clinical and use that to describe their processes. And folks are going through real emotion that we could term as a PTSD. A good friend of mine, Dr. Napoleon Wells, works with the government in the VA hospital and works primarily with people who are victimized by PTSD. And so I talk to him on a regular basis, try to understand what it is that's going on in the psyche of these folks who've undergone these deep oppression, who've been victimized in many interesting ways, seen violence and death for the first time, come back home and can't sleep at night, and have all these things affecting their lives. And he describes them to me beautifully, and he says, listen, when somebody is carted from a place of comfort and put into a place of discomfort, that alone creates a trauma. that gets exacerbated by the fact that you might be able to witness some violence that you've never seen before. That gets exacerbated by the fact that you're around people who see you as an enemy when you position an ideology or a self-perspective of a person that's loving and lovable. And so folks oftentimes who engage or who have been suffered from PTSD, when they become diagnosed, they're approached from a place of absolute love, understanding that in many instances they had no part to play in the trauma that they've been a part of as they engage in this practice of fighting for their nation. Now, PTSD has also been expanded to folks who've had other traumatic experiences, but the primary association of a PTSD is to a person who's gone to war, experienced violence, come back home, and has had these things happen in their lives as a result of that experience. And I make the argument that that PTSD lens must be the lens that we use to look at the young people who are the victims of health inequities and educational inequities, because they're undergoing severe trauma daily. But the language of trauma is not used to describe their experiences, but it's because it's become normalized. The normalizing of their experiences, the describing it as the nature of who they are and how they are. Right? The creation of the person who causes the trauma to exist as the person who's the helper to go in there, so that you cannot see it as trauma. The processes of an institution or a set of institutions that take folks who are not from any place anywhere near the hood and put them in the hood and never undergo the process of understanding the communities where they're going to be working for the very first time. And then the kids come into the school with a certain culture, and then the instructor comes to the school with a different culture, a certain culture, and then they clash in that space, and the kids can't breathe. When we talk about we can't breathe, we talk about we can't breathe in classrooms. Right? And the kids are in there, can't breathe, can't see beyond that norm. And no one can view that experience as trauma on that young person. But rather, they view it as the person who came in there to do the work, as a healer, as a hero, as a person who can leave after 2 years and go become working in D.C. to create more structures that created the issue they were in to begin with. Y'all see what I'm saying? When Pierre Bourdieu talks about this idea of symbolic violence, it's not a violence of somebody knocking you over the head and beating you up. It's a violence of being in a social space where your culture, yourself, your authentic self cannot merge with the culture of the institution. And every young person who comes from certain communities that goes into classrooms that are created not for them to have voice is undergoing everyday symbolic violence. The symbolic violence over time creates trauma. Trauma over time creates PTSD. That post-traumatic stress that every young person in classrooms is experiencing every day, when it goes undiagnosed, when we fail to use that framework to look at the young people in our classrooms, we fail them. Now, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, but I also make the argument that there are a bunch of other PTSDs. There's a post-Trayvon Martin stress disorder in our communities. And our unwillingness to recognize that leads to other issues. When a young person in a classroom, that I have a conversation with, and I said, talk about Trayvon, and he can't speak. And he finally begins to speak, and he starts describing a rap where he can imagine himself on that street in Florida and can see the experience happening. When he can make a vivid connection of placing himself in the context of another person. Because when he saw that image flash across the TV screens consistently, each of those flashing of that image on a TV screen is trauma. Why? Because that person I'm seeing on that screen looks just like me. I wear that hoodie. I love Skittles. I drink Arizonas. So the very seeing of an image that is like you, killed in the street and allowed to walk free, instantaneously creates a traumatic experience for a young person, because they see themselves as having no worth, just like that person had no worth. That is a trauma. Have we addressed the post-Trayvon Martin stress disorder in our communities? And what are the effects of a PTSD? When we talk about folks who are heroes who experience a PTSD, how do we frame that? We talk about the fact that over time, other things will happen in their lives. They're more likely to have strokes. They're most likely to engage in violent practices. They're more likely to need intensive preparation for adjustment to real life. And we can frame that idea when we talk about others, but not by our babies. who are undergoing the contemporary versions of that stress. Beyond that, we have to look at the institutions that create that stress. Whenever a stressful situation is created, and this is based on a PTSD experts have talked to me about this in their work in their field. He said the first thing you have to do is you have to work to extract the person from the scenario or the circumstances that are triggers for the enactment of that behavior. You have to take the person out of that place in order to allow them to heal. Well, every day kids are being forced. It's mandatory that you send your kids to that school. They are forced to be there. Now, if in a PTSD traditional case, we know that one of the first things that you are supposed to do to avoid the trauma is to remove the person from the setting that causes the trigger for that trauma. And we acknowledge that and we do that for everybody else. Why don't we do that for our babies? And when we don't do that for our babies, it yields collateral results. I.e., what would happen with somebody who is suffering from traditional PTSD? They are more likely to engage in violent practices. They're more likely to raise their voice in classrooms. They're more likely to be frustrated. But the symptoms that are exhibited from the PTSD becomes a reason for the maintaining of the practices that cause it to happen. Only for them and not for others. Y'all follow what I'm saying? Yeah. Now let's move this a little further. And we talk about a post-Trayvon Martin or even a post-Tamir Rice stress disorder, which is the most contemporary one, that shooting that happened. But let's talk about a poor teaching stress disorder. I'm for real. We have been forced to believe that teaching and learning is the penultimate way through which one reaches a certain level of emancipation or upward mobility and success. But that version of teaching and learning includes teaching and learning within very specific institutions with very specific goals. What if I were to tell you, I feel like Neo in the Matrix, what if I were to tell you for 1 second that you don't need traditional teaching and learning to engage in emancipatory practice? And now I'm a professor in a teaching education institution and a scientist by training, but I am saying that you have to first be able to extract our young people from the context where they are embedded for them to be able to release their stress. That we have to move them out of the school. Now, that could get you a lot of trouble. When we're going to say en masse, we're taking everybody out to school because the school is not working. But I make the argument that there are alternatives. That we got to put on a new lens, a new hat. And we could argue for the creation of third spaces within traditional classrooms that create alternate realities even within the space that they're embedded. So we gotta look, y'all, you gotta look at this thing different. Because if you keep looking at it the way that they're giving it to you, we could talk revolution all day and ain't nothing gonna happen. So what does this third space look like? It looks like creating the context within that classroom to allow the kids to be able to transcend the physical space and enter into another space, which is a way of teaching and learning, engaging that those from African roots and traditions engaged in before they went to the traditional school. Anybody ever seen somebody catch the Holy Ghost in church? What happens? They run around. The physical building no longer exists for them in that moment because they're going through a certain form of escapism to help them to be able to deal with the situations that's at present. Y'all feel what I'm saying? So what we need to do in schools, one, I would argue if you could, if oppressive practices are going on in schools, get the kid out the school. But if the kids aren't going to school, that's why we're doing this. That's why we're doing this program. That's why we're doing this training. That's why we're doing this certificate program. Look, this work is not done. We didn't. Dr. Wallace and I didn't convene and start having conversations about engaging in this practice because we felt like it. We're doing this work because it's the necessary work. How do you engage in those emancipatory spaces? Guess what? Guess what? Hip-hop. I said it once, I say it again. Why? Because hip-hop becomes the chief mechanism through which these young people who are engaging in this PTSD find an escape, a temporary one, albeit, from the PTSD. When a young person is sitting in a classroom and writing a verse, or when a rapper is sitting on the stage and imagining himself with 50 Bentleys because he's piss poor, that is their own self-diagnosis and self-medication to be able to escape the PTSD of living within these communities and within these schools. When Pharaoh Mon says, "If you know about struggle, the boy in the plastic bubble. When I drink away the pain, I guzzle. My life is like a complicated mathematical puzzle for real. Seen death twice as an ugly mother effer, man. But you conversate with him when you suffering. He said, let go of the pain, you never rock the mic again. Your choice slept to the brain of 20 Vicodin. I kind of likened it to also tricycling, disturbing the natural cycles of life and its trifling. F what you heard, less money, more problems." This is a person in a verse who is describing a stressful situation and using the creation of this verse as a means through which he can escape that reality and deal with that stress. So if folks are doing this and self-diagnosing and doing this on their own, and schools become the main mechanism of oppression, then what we are asking you to support us in doing is bringing this mechanism that they've been doing in a self-diagnosis on their own, unstructured, unbridled, into the school to create these third spaces where they can have some release. Listen, when a community only gets release or treatment from their PTSD by living a fantasy that's on television, we know that not only are the young people victims of a PTSD, but we all collectively are. When Shonda Rhimes writes an issue of a television show of Scandal and mimics what happens with that young man or young men who've been killed at the hands of police and reconstructs what happened, right? Reconstructs a scenario of a young man being shot in the street, his father being upset, then creates a fantasy of the father having the agency enough to be able to fight for his son, then constructs a fantasy of the Department of Justice caring enough to be able to make a statement, and constructs a fantasy of the president having the ability to be able to speak to the issue that just happened, and constructs a fantasy of that man being able, not villainized by the media, but being seen as a whole person, and having the ability to heal and cry. When a television show is the only mechanism through which we can have freedom and release from the stress of our existence, something is terribly wrong. And that's not a contemporary issue. That's been happening for a very long time. When we got the Cosby Show to be an image of the perfect family in the midst of Reaganomics and crack in Brooklyn. And watching the show becomes the only release. We're in a sick place. And the reason why we're in a sick place is because what we've become doing is we end up in a process where we are given the weapons of mass distraction. Right? I can live my fantasy of freedom out through a television show. Therefore, I don't have to go into the real life and real work and do the work for freedom, for healing. Look, this work of looking at the trauma that we've all underwent and we all still undergo is not only necessary work for us to identify in the communities that we want to heal, but it's necessary work for each and every one of us to do. As we sit in this space as scholars and academics and aspiring academics, we oftentimes are the weakest ones. Why do I say that? Because the strongest ones are sometimes the ones who refuse to be able to become acclimated into the structure and say no. We who think we are the heroes are oftentimes the ones who were easily broken and bent enough to believe the narrative that going through these structures and these institutions were going to lead us towards freedom and healing from our stresses. We have been forced to villainize those who are more strong among us. Every time we get another MS and EDD and PhD and MPH, and we feel that we've arrived to a certain place because as we go along, we become bent and bent and bent and bent to the structures of the institution to allow us to be distracted by the conversations that they want us to have. A conversation like standardized test scores. You know, the argument about standardized test scores had been debated, and we've already pretty much proved that they weren't worth a damn thing since 1929, when they tried to make the argument that the Army test scores were a marker of intelligence for soldiers. We've established that using those markers to be able to value our intelligence doesn't work since then. the chief conversation about urban education contemporarily is whether or not we're going to support the standardized exam, deny the standardized exam. Heated debates everywhere on the news. Anybody who has a part to play in education is having a conversation about this thing. We already knew since 1900 the shit don't work. And we're still deeply embedded in the conversation about it. Why? It's a weapon of mass distraction. It is so easy to become so deeply connected to the conversation about standardized test scores that you don't have the conversation about the fact that a kid is in the classroom every day looking at bars of windows, and as he sees those bars in those windows, it reminds him that he's in a modern day prison, and he's feeling stressed and gets frustrated and gets upset at the teacher, which leads into suspension, which suspension statistics tell us will lead him into the prison industrial complex. We talk about test scores when we ain't talking about bars on windows. We talk about test scores when we're talking about a curriculum that's not shifted since the Carlisle School for Native American populations, that took Native American populations all across the United States, put them in a school and said we're going to give them a better education, and did so by Americanizing them, by cutting off their hair, taking away their language, forcing them to sit in rows, and every class picture from then till now involves our kids standing up and smiling in rows. And we haven't talked about the fact that we are replicating that same process, but we talk about some damn test scores. So, I want to close. I got so much notes here and so much to say, but I actually even don't even want to, I don't feel like I want to preach no more, man. I just want to talk. I just want to, thank you, brother. You know, I just want to have us realize just a few things. I'm just going to lay out a few lines just for us to think about as we go ahead. Is that all right? Just to ponder. One, we are all teachers. Whether you're a classroom teacher, a healthcare professional, a doctor, interested in public health, you're a teacher. It is a fallacy. It is a construction that we don't have the ability to be able to teach and engage. We all have the skill set to be able to teach. Now, this is not to say that some people don't need to be certified and some people are more equipped to teach 30 kids at a time. But by virtue of being in a space like this, soaking in information, you have the ability to be able to teach somebody else this information and open their eyes to the reality. We are all teachers. The language of making teaching seem as though it's a profession that is the lowest on a totem pole, it's a construction because it allows those who have the most power to feel the most powerless. When you have the people who have the most power feel the most powerless, and you have everybody who ain't got nothing to do, ain't got no strength making all the decisions. When we start believing that our work is to teach, then we can move towards transformation. Question is about science education. Why is that so important? Because it's a language of discourse and power. If a young person goes to see a doctor, a healthcare professional, a psychologist, and doesn't sit there like a dummy while everybody talks about them, which is what happens. People always ask me, why did you choose science education? Because I know the power that science has. If you allow somebody to be scientifically literate, to engage in a discourse of power in any space, to be like, oh, no, we're not talking about that. I know what the effects of that is on my body. No, it's not a self-construction. No, there are asthma clusters in my neighborhood, and they're chlorofluorocarbons, and these are the reasons why it happens. You see, when you're able to have the agency to be able to use the discourse of power to be able to describe your circumstances, then people don't talk about you. They have to talk to you. That's why we engage in science education. That's why science education is important for health education. So we are all teachers. Now, my lines. The way that a teacher teaches can be traced directly back to the way that teacher has been taught. The time will always come when a teacher must ask themselves if they will follow the mold or blaze a new trail. We are all relying upon the structures that we came from. We have to acknowledge that those structures are broken. Just because you have some version or modicum of success doesn't mean that that success is for everybody else. You know, I remember really vividly when I went into grad school for the first time, and I was feeling myself. You know, I was the one black kid in a group of 30 at Rensselaer Polytechnic doing natural sciences. I walked up in there like, yes, you know, nigga, we made it. You know, I was feeling myself, right? And as I went into that space and I navigated that space and I was challenged for my scientific prowess or not, I started realizing something very powerful. I started realizing that in that space, when I was thinking that I had all these things, the most smartest kids I know were not in that space with me. Right? The kid who could memorize the entire rap album the Jabari Johnson who could write a rap album in 3 hours were in those spaces with me. And I was wondering why that happened. And it's because they were hyping me up, gassing me up, because I was easily bending. I knew how to play the game good enough, so they hyped me up to the point where the weak version of me was the one who entered into that space until I engaged in what Maxine Green called my own wide awakeness, confronted with my own realities, right? So you got to break from tradition. Second thing here at the end, as I close out, the effectiveness of the teacher or the practitioner can be traced directly back to what that practitioner or teacher thinks of the student. I want you to think about that. You know, we got to do some self-challenging time. The discourse we've had today about the inequities, do we describe those students as them or other as we talk about saving them? Look, that hero complex will F you up. Because everybody wants to be a hero. But we don't need heroes. Because sometimes to be a hero, it means to see everybody as a victim. But if we change how we view them and see them as genius in the making, right? As genius who have been hampered by these stressors that we're going to help them to release from so they can be who they are supposed to be and guide the charge, then we change how we engage with them. Third, how successful the teacher is in the classroom is directly related to how successful the teacher thinks the students can be. All right? The teacher or practitioner who holds within themselves perceptions of the inadequacies of the student will never be able to teach them to something greater than what they are. Planning for your work and your engagement with the population is valuable, but being willing to let go of that plan is beyond value. I taught myself that today. Y'all should see all these darn notes. You know? That what we think is what works may not necessarily be what works, and we have to be able to create the space to allow them to bring themselves. And I could wax poetic about this one here for a minute. If y'all indulge me for like another 3 seconds, I'll get back on track. Right? This notion that teaching and learning, especially for the populations who are suffering, has to be deeply personal. And if it's deeply personal, my students know this, then it can't be standardized. If teaching and learning is inherently personal and is supposed to be attuned to the ways of knowing and being of the population that you're delivering or sharing the information with, then the nature of teaching and learning itself is counter to standardization. Now, I can standardize the assessment. I can standardize my thinking to a detriment, but I cannot standardize how I teach. And the minute where we get to the point where everything about our work is all about protocol and lesson plan and curriculum, with no breaks from that narrative, no points of fracture and departure, then we become actually creating a process where we are reinstilling the biases and recreating the tensions. Fourth, the longer a teacher teaches, the better they are at their practice. Now, that practice may be empowering for students, or it may break the spirit. The decision belongs to the teacher. Can y'all soak that in for me for a second? The more you do what you've been doing, that's it? Okay. 15 minutes. The more you've been doing what you've been doing, the better you are at what you've been doing. Whether what you're doing is good or bad for the student. I want to just see the eyes and make sure the wheels is turning. Right? If I teach to a lesson in a curriculum every single day, by the 4th year, I am a pro at it. I could walk in there with my eyes closed and teach it. I am so good at it at that point then that I am an expert in that thing. But if that thing is negative, then I become the master oppressor in that classroom. And the more I engage in the emancipatory practice as a pedagogue and a practitioner, the better I am at that work as well. And we know, sociologists have told us, that every consistent patterned action over time becomes ritual. So oppressive pedagogy becomes ritualized practice. And then lastly, I choose hip-hop. Because why I choose hip-hop is because you could use your heart, H, Your inspiration, I, and your power, P. To heal, H, from oppressive pedagogy. Hip-hop is the opportunity for us to engage in the language of the learner to be able to transgress against the structures of schooling. And I can use hip-hop to teach anything you give me. I could teach science, I could teach social studies, I could teach underwater basket weaving, I could teach astrophysics. If you give me the opportunity to be able to utilize the language of the learner to be able to describe how to teach them. Use your heart, inspiration, and power to heal oppressive pedagogy. Hip-hop. Thank you. We've got about 5 minutes for questions, I think. Yeah, 10? That's great. So if you have questions, please come up to that microphone or this one here.
You referred to alternative certification programs. You kind of alluded to that. Mm-hmm. And the effects of these kinds of programs and the short-term tendency and how that sort of facilitates this reoccurring symbolic violence. Mm-hmm. So I just want to hear from you what your perspective is on this, on how to really resolve this issue, when we know that currently that is sort of where the direction of teaching is going, is these alternative certifications. Mm-hmm. And the profiteering that is becoming of this. So I just wanted to get your perspective on what you think and how this is impacting this sort of cyclical issue.
I mean, I think the privatization of privatization of prisons, as we heard last night, earlier this morning, is analogous to the privatization of schools. But we fail to have that conversation. And the reason why I say that is because, let's play out an authentic scenario. You have a young person who is in a school in Harlem, and it's a traditional public school, and that child gets into fights on a consistent basis. The child is not doing well in the school. The parent goes and finds out what's going on with that child and is frustrated because they don't feel like that child is getting the best education in that space. Is that parent justified in arguing for an alternate to that public school? The answer is yes, absolutely. But what has happened in the contemporary era is that we have a pop-up privatization movement that frames itself as the counter to the traditional public school. So it doesn't necessarily make an argument about how I'm better, where I'll be better, how I'll make your students feel better, how I'll cater to their spirit, how I'll cater to their soul, how I'll cater to helping them reimagine themselves in different ways. It just says, I am private and I am different. And I will give you fancy uniforms too. Right? And so what we have in that instance is a parent who's looking at the structure of a traditional school and saying, oh my God, I don't want this for my child. I need anything else. And they look around and they say, oh my gosh, those uniforms are neat. And that person has made me promises. So they run there simply because it serves as an alternative, which is a necessary emotion and is a genuine and authentic emotion. But if the resources were spent on addressing the core issues within the first institution, to allow there to be a place where we are addressing the PTSD issues, then there would be no need for the alternative. Particularly when we know that the alternative, and statistically that's fact, has the same or less results than what was perceived to be the broken school to begin with. And so I'm anti-privatization simply for the purpose that it's not been spelled out as a way to engage in different practices. It's just presented as an alternate practice, and the alternate practice essentially becomes a reaffirmation of existing practice with pretty uniforms and maybe, no metal detector. Listen, it's a self-constructed thing, y'all. Look, our mayor pissed off the police department. And when he did that, they were like, you know what? We ain't arresting nobody. And when he decided not to arrest anybody, guess what happened? Crime went down exponentially. And when the crime went down exponentially, we were going through the hood with the same reality. There wasn't more violence. There wasn't more murders. The kids weren't scared less to go to school. We just did what we were doing anyway, and we were all right. And in the minute that they resolved their tensions, the arrest rates and the crime went up, and the hood is still the same. So this is all smoke and mirrors. essentially. And so we have to go beyond a point where we don't fall victim to the creation of alternate forms, when in reality it's a replication of the same practice. What we want to do is we want to go back and occupy schools with the information that we've been armed with today to create new structures for teaching and learning, to have kids be able to have some release. I hope I answered your question.
Sorry, you did. And then it also made me think of a second follow-up question to that, which, sorry to hog, but just also in thinking of things that could help students with PTSD, like getting them an appropriate IEP or providing them with the services that they need. That is often very, for the students who don't have the family resources to be able to get an IEP, or for the teachers to not use their own subjective practices and thinking, oh, that student doesn't need an IEP, this one does. And how do you overcome these things? Like,
I think we need a bevy of folks to enter into policy and argue for equity on that sphere. I make no apologies about that. I believe that. But I also think that one of the answers to that is to really train teachers to be able to engage in this kind of pedagogical practice. I mean, that really is the answer. So while we wait for folks who are doing the work to change the structures that be, because we need folks to do that work, I'm down to do that work, you call me, I'll be there. We also need to be able to train our teachers to be able to engage in the pedagogical practices every day in classrooms, to help them to be able to do what Ian and I have been arguing for, right? Where you can go into the classroom and teach science, and at the same time have kids be able to unearth their frustrations and their tensions and their anger, and then use that same tool to be able to help them to be successful in the learning process. We did Science Genius. Science Genius project was having kids in New York City public schools write raps about science. It sounds simplistic. I did it on a budget of $1, literally. I didn't ask for no grants because I didn't want anybody telling me what to do. Right? Because, and I'll take the money if you're going to help me to do what I know works. And I can show you works, but I'm not going to take it if you're going to make me do something that runs counter to my mission. Right? So we did with $1. And me getting like, yo, take the train, fam, and meet me there and work on your rap, right? And then we have these kids across these schools who wrote these brilliant science raps in the subjects that we thought they would underperform, where they would traditionally underperformed the most. And we had, and guess what happened? They showed up to school more often. They were more engaged in conversations. They were more likely to take advanced science classrooms, and their grades went up. So it's a matter of the teacher in the classroom being trained to be able to understand what these transformative approaches to teaching and learning is. And while we do the work to address the policy, we do the work to engage in transformative healing practices in classrooms. And those two things concurrently can move us towards revolution.
I agree. And I think that transforming the data or replicating the studies making it so that people can see that these are evidence-based approaches and these things do work can be that hopefully moving force that shows people that this is actually a truly revolutionary form of transformation, and it's not just simply the old paradigm reframed.
Right.
So,
amen.
Keep going.
On that note, at York University in Toronto, my teacher and I'm in university, but I was in grade 12. We developed an AQ qualification to be a teacher in alternative schools. I went to alternative schools my entire school year, school life. Alternative spaces are important in mainstream and outside as well, because some of us can't function in numbers too, right? We have PSTDs that are to do the numbers as well, right? Too much oppression in one space, right? From my peers who are oppressive as well, right? So the AQ at York University, you should talk to Herman or whatever, but they have an AQ. So to teach in alternative schools, it's good to have the qualification so you know how to use the alternative spaces and create those spaces in classrooms. And I wrote that as well as a student. So having that insight as well, it's a big thing. Alternative spaces are big, because I was that kid who was pushed out of school, looking at bars, but what the fuck am I here for? What am I doing? And got mad at teachers. So I found a new space to be in that actually fostered me to grow up and be where I am right now. So that's big work to you. Good things. If you want to connect, I'm in Toronto, and we have the AQs there to look at, and what it means to have those spaces developed and created for teachers as well, because they can get their hands on it for free if they're in teachers college. It's like an AQ to get. It's not required yet, but it's going to be required hopefully soon, because alternative schools in Toronto, there's so many of them, and there's so many different walks of life in those schools, and teachers are going there. They're getting pushed in there. It's like a dumping ground for teachers who couldn't get jobs, and they don't want to be there. They don't want to deal with us kids who can't function under this dominant culture. This shit sitting at a desk. In my school, we don't have desks. We have couches and bean bags. You know what I'm saying? Like, that's all I'm saying. I learned how to sleep at school.
That's
But,
real.
yeah.
Well, first of all, I just want to say thank you for that question. And also, shout out to the fam from Toronto. Where y'all at, the Toronto family? You know, they came by. How many hours on the bus? Too many hours on the bus, man. I appreciate and love y'all so much. I can't wait to come up to Toronto in a week or two to come holler at y'all and kick it with y'all. I think you raised a very important point. And this is important to note on that point, is that these schools for the most affluent, I want y'all to realize this. The schools for the most affluent, the schools for those who have the most wealth, look exactly like those schools that you described. Like, so the schools for those who don't have the structures in place to create the PTSDs, like you could pay high tuition to get in there, it looks like an alternative space.
Oh, you're right. I was working for the school board in Toronto, and like I got to go to private schools. And we were supposed to go and get them instructional teaching how to use the spaces better. Bro, I walk into the school and it's like desk, chalkboard, sit down, where's your uniform? And it's like, that's not alternative. It's just, like you said, they're masking the same thing in a different way, basically. And we'd go in there and they'd be like, you guys can't come back here. You're a little bit too far off from what we're doing here. And it's crazy because you're paying $30,000 a year to put your kid in that same shitty shithole that's not working for anybody.
Right.
And it's privilege. Yep. The privilege, I had to deconstruct power and privilege. Because this is a privileged thing that I can't get. Well, I don't want it though, but if I didn't want it, I couldn't afford it. Yep. Some of our parents, we can't afford that $30,000 a year. You crazy? We don't make $30,000 a year. So, that's it.
You right, bro. You right.
Good morning. Thank
Good
you
morning.
for this inspiring presentation. Okay, just a quick comment. I lived overseas. I have 4 children, and I had the kids in a private school. I'm sorry.
Let's all just get closer to it.
Hello?
There you go.
Okay, great. Just a personal commentary. I lived overseas in the Middle East for 7 years in Saudi Arabia. My kids went to a private school. That was really our only option because it was an American school, the only American school. And we had a really wonderful experience. I mean, they thrived beautifully. And yes, it was definitely a privileged environment. Most parents were two-couple, marriages. And, I think the kids had mostly come from stable environments. But what was remarkable was when I did come back to Florida at that time. I'm from New York, but I believed in the public school system and put my kids in public school. And it was truly like a disaster for them. I mean, the 4 of them, from middle school to high school, they were devastated. The first day we stood there and they were like, Mom, please take us home. I want to go back to Saudi Arabia. I mean, it's like they picked up the very things that you were talking about. They said, Mom, it's a prison. There's all these rules. They're always yelling at us. Everything we do is wrong. And my kids were like good students. They had no disciplinary issues and so forth. My daughter was an A student, musician, and the very first day she was punished for wearing a certain kind of sandal. And we had our stuff coming in shipment, and I didn't have that many clothes. And they took her out of the class and stuck her in the cafeteria for the entire day and punished her for wearing those sandals. This is in Florida, like 10 years ago. I mean, I called the school, and I was so new, I wasn't even sure how to take the roads to get there, and I was in a mess and, very upset. And when I picked her up, she just about had a breakdown from the way she was treated, and then she missed the bus because she was so upset. It was the hardest transition we ever lived in our life to come back to the American school system as Americans.
Listen, all I could say is, you described the scenario and you described just that it was violence and it was trauma. And could you imagine that trauma being multiplied by being overcrowdedness, and then being multiplied by, you talk about the clothes they wear, but when you have to wear your blackness and you can't take that off, and it's multiplied by, and so it's that same scenario. And for kids who are in certain circumstances, it's almost an exaggerated version of that. And you're right, it's trauma. It's traumatic.
This is worth a standing ovation. Come on, let's get up. Come on.